Well, Linda, welcome. I'm looking forward to chatting with you today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you here. When you reached out and you told me a little bit about your story and the things that you have worked through, I thought this would be a lovely conversation to have because I think a lot of people are working through similar things. The details, the dynamics might be different, but the navigating painful areas of life is something I think a lot of people are working through. So I thought it'd be lovely to chat about that today.
Oh, great. That's what I'm here for.
Terrific. Tell me a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Um, well, I have a my career history was various professions, helping people. So I was a social worker and a Red Cross director, and then went back to college and got my master's in counselor education. So I finished out my career of working in the schools for more than 20 years and was a high school counselor. So I'm retired now. And in retirement, I wrote a book about an experience that I had um, when I was around 40 years old. And had gone back to graduate school and was triggered in a counseling class that I was in, um, and brought back a lot of memories of a rape that I had experienced when I was young and single and on my own. And it started full-blown PTSD. So along with being in graduate school for counseling, started a therapy journey. And what I wrote about was primarily the experience of being in therapy and um, how it helps you change your perspective and change your life.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you went back to graduate school to study a type of therapy. And in one of the classes, it brings up some things that you've been carrying around, and then that catalyzes your therapy journey. So I guess that brings the question of why did you go back to school to study therapy?
I was working in the schools. I was working with students and um, I didn't have a graduate degree in counselor education, but I was working in the counseling department.
Hmm.
Um, and uh, what I had studied and been working on. I was working on a grant for 6 years they were called School to Work grants, and it was really working with students to identify where their career interests were so that they would make good decisions, with their education and going forward into college to be able to pursue things that they really cared about. So, as a social worker, that was very evident to me that people needed more career exploration and more knowledge to make better decisions for themselves about
Hmm.
life because it so impacts everything about your life. Um, that was my goal for going back. And it was the first counseling class. It was a counseling theories class, and we were talking a lot about counseling and therapy
Hmm.
in the class. And right towards the end of it, when we were just having it was towards the end of the course, we were having kind of a group, sit in a circle and talk about stuff and ask questions. And I asked the question about therapy and if there are times when it feels worse instead of feeling better, because I had had that
Hmm.
experience right after I had been raped. I saw a therapist within 6 months, and it was not a good fit, and I felt terrible, and I
No,
just
yeah.
left and never went back, and
Mm.
so this was almost 20 years down the road, and the professor said that one of the times that it's worse is when you have a rape in your background that you haven't dealt with,
Mhm.
and then you do go to therapy, that therapy is going to be harder before things get better because you're going back to all sorts of things that you didn't wanna think about the first time.
Yes.
So, yeah, so that's that was a real trigger. I felt like somebody had just thrown something at me, and I was trying not to blink while I was in the class, and when I left, before I even got home, I was having re-experiencing symptoms, and
Mhm.
it turned into full-blown PTSD pretty quickly.
Hmm. Okay. So this is really interesting in the sense that you had this very traumatic experience. You sought help for it, didn't get the help that you needed. In fact, it was sounded like it might have re-exacerbated or exacerbated the situation even more.
It it just wasn't it was not a good therapeutic, uh, fit, I
Mhm.
think, for that kind of trauma, and
Yeah.
it's something that I talk about in the book, like, how do you find a good fit?
Mhm.
One of the things that that particular therapist did was to direct the therapy, which is, for people who have been in a traumatic situation where they didn't have control, um, having a therapist take control is not,
Mhm.
helpful.
Yeah.
So she took control. I felt judged because she was choosing to talk about, my background, my family, all sorts of things, and I just was feeling very judged. I was traumatized at the time.
Mhm.
Anyway, so yes,
Yeah.
I talked to
Okay.
some people. They said if you're feeling worse, then it's probably not a good fit. And so I left therapy and I
Yeah.
just buried everything and moved on with
Mhm.
my life. And the
Yes.
that's what I did.
Mhm. So you needed help. You didn't get the help, and the way you adapted to it was by burying,
Yeah.
disconnecting. So I just want to draw attention to this because this seems really important, which is there was a part of you that knew that you still needed help. And so then 20 years later, when you go to counseling or when you start studying counseling, this part of you immediately gets activated and says, ah, here's where I can find some help.
Yeah, I think I went to the professor after a couple of weeks of feeling crazy,
Hmm.
and because I didn't know what was going on, I didn't know what
Yeah.
was happening. It had been years,
Hmm.
um, and he explained about PTSD and explained that I was, as a lot of people are, I was, very strong and very controlled, and I couldn't understand why I could not control um, the thoughts that I was having and the re-experiencing that I was having. And when he
Hmm.
explained PTSD to me and how, the memory works and what happens in those traumatic situations for some people, he said, you're going to need help working on this. This is not something that you can control.
Yeah.
So I reluctantly I reluctantly, started to try and find a therapist, and it was because I had felt burned before, and I
Hmm.
didn't really trust the therapeutic process, and there was also, and I'm finding now as I talk to more people about this that it's pretty typical, but I have things that I swore I would never talk about, that there were things that really embarrassed or humiliated me in my life, and I
Hmm.
wasn't going to talk about those, and I was worried that if I went to a therapist, that maybe a therapist could wheedle it out of me, and I was just determined that there were things I wasn't going to talk about.
Hmm.
So it made it really uncomfortable and scary to go to therapy.
It's a bit of a conflict then, an internal conflict, it sounds
It's a
like.
huge conflict, yeah.
Yeah. Where you want to keep certain things buried and hidden, but the goal of therapy is to bring these things to the light so you can see them and work with them.
Right. But there are things in our lives that we've done that we're just embarrassed or humiliated
Of
by.
course.
And in my, uh, wisdom on this end of life, I realize that we are much tougher on ourselves, that the things that
Of
humiliate
course.
us are often just really normal things that isn't a surprise that people would respond or react or behave in a certain way, but we're really hard on ourselves. And so those things are humiliating. And, there's no way that you want to draw attention to that. You want to
Mhm.
hide that. So,
Sure.
but I was in this counseling program. I knew I had to go to therapy. I was feeling pretty crazy. And so I found a therapist.
Mhm. Where do you think you learned to be so harsh and critical to yourself?
Um, well, I've talked to a lot of people, and as I worked with high school students for 20 years, I did a lot of
Mhm.
personal counseling with them, but I also worked with some really high achieving students.
Mhm.
And what I really discovered was that people who are high achieving a lot of times, um, a lot of people have really good lives and a lot of people that love them, and a lot of times you get put on a pedestal. I grew up as the oldest daughter in a large family, and I was well loved and I was on a pedestal. I was very helpful, and it's hard to stay on that pedestal because what's going on inside of your head was, "Oh, I'm screwing up." You're really hard on yourself when other people are
Mhm.
praising you all the time, and then you start trying to create what you think they're seeing.
I see.
Um,
Expectations.
so yes, and the people that love you a lot of times I think know you very well, and the way that you are is just fine, but in your head, you're feeling unworthy of all of that
Mhm.
adulation or whatever it is that you're getting, praise. And so you start to be really tough on yourself. And I saw a lot of really accomplished kids do that.
Mhm.
And I've seen when I talk about it, really accomplished adults nod their head in agreement when I talk about that little voice in your head that's kind of beating you up saying, "You screwed this one up," and, um, just trying to live up to the way that you think other people are looking at you.
Yeah. Yeah, this is very common right here, which is the things that are most important to us, especially as children, are attachments, our connections. Can't survive without them. And then, of course, the need for individuality to be who we are as individuals, unique people, to be authentic to that. And ideally, we'd have both of those. But in almost every relationship in modern culture today, those two do not go together. There's some sort of idea of who you should be as a child, some way of acting, behaving, or being. And so what we end up doing is suppressing who we are in lots of ways and trying to be or mask or become who we think we should be or who we're told we should be. And this is the source of great suffering, which leads me to ask you a question here. You talked about burying emotions or burying or disconnecting the things that had happened to you. Where did you learn that from?
Um, I think in our society
Hmm.
that we're rewarded um, for being able to handle difficult situations, for keeping our heads about us, um, for being mature. I
Mhm.
always was. I was mature as a kid. I was helpful with the other kids. And then when I was 11, my grandmother, who I was very close to, she was like a second mother to me. Um, she was killed in a house fire at her house. And I think that was the first time that I really remember, um, intentionally burying how I was feeling about things because,
Mhm.
she was my mother's mother, and I saw how devastated my mom was, and then I had lots of younger siblings, and as she was telling them, I was in the next room listening. She had told me, and I was just in shock, and then I listened as she sat with each one of the kids and told them what happened, and as younger siblings were crying, I was thinking, "Don't cry because this is already so hard on mom, you're just making it harder."
I
That
see.
was my
Mhm.
eleven-year-old assessment,
Yeah.
and I think that I have taken that a lot to heart in
Mhm.
my, going forward.
I see.
Just tough it up, you can take care of
Mhm.
it, and I was very helpful and very mature, through the whole process of, cleaning out the house and having people
Mhm.
cleaning out my grandmother's house, having people call our house and ask questions. I was able to be a young adult, and people would say they were surprised that I was a kid, and I took all of that to heart. Those
Yeah.
are all rewards for being tough.
But they shouldn't have been rewards. That's the trauma right there. Is when you were 11 years old, you were taking care of other people.
Yeah, yeah,
You were responsible for your mother's emotions and your siblings' emotions, and you were taking care of their well-being when you needed somebody to be taking care of you.
yeah, and other people didn't expect that of me, but I put that on myself, and then I was proud of myself for doing
Mhm.
that, and I've
Yeah.
seen people my entire life that's what kind of drives them.
Yeah. Well, that would make sense because when we were talking about your career path, you were saying you like to help people.
Yeah, I knew, from the time I was in high school, I
Mhm.
realized that I wanted to, um I call it even the playing field. I felt very lucky. I had a great family and loving parents, and I knew that everybody didn't have that, and I felt
Mhm.
like it wasn't fair that I had that and everybody didn't, and I just felt this compulsion to help try and even the playing field for people to
Yeah.
help people have a better life. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
Wow, that's an interesting dynamic. It sounds like shame. I have something, I shouldn't have it, or other people don't have it, and there's some sort of negative
Imbalance.
connotations. What was that?
There's an imbalance, an
Imbalance, yeah.
imbalance to life.
Mhm. And here, what we're finding is, yes, you had loving parents. Yes, you had a wonderful childhood, and that's not the full story. On
Right.
the other hand, there were high demands of you, whether it was real or perceived. And as a child, your role wasn't there to be a child. It was reversed. You became the adult. You became the parent at a time where you needed an adult and a parent to take care of you.
Yeah, but I had that. I mean, I had that a
Hmm.
lot, and this is funny that I've just as much as I've talked about shame
Hmm.
and um, how toxic that is, um, I just within the past few days have started thinking about pride
Hmm.
and our, um, that our being proud of ourselves and our carrying pride is often a precursor to shame.
Yeah.
That what put me in that situation was not my parents being expecting it of me. It was
Mhm.
the pride that I felt in being the young adult and being so helpful.
Yeah.
And, um, and I think that there are a lot of rewards um, to being accomplished,
Mhm.
and you have a lot of pride in that.
Yeah.
But then you start in your own head where nobody can hear it, you start beating yourself up when you feel like you're falling short,
Uh-huh.
and you might and it's really interesting. I had a conversation with a young trauma nurse who is very accomplished, and she read my book, and then she wrote to me and told me that, um, she's always there for everybody else, and people will
Yes.
come to her, but when she
Mhm.
needs when things are difficult for her, she said a lot of times she wonders why people don't ask her how she's doing. But
Yeah.
then she said, because if people asked me how I was doing, I would tell them I was doing fine and I was
Mhm.
handling it because I
Yeah.
have this persona that I put out that I can handle everything. And
Yes.
she said, I didn't realize that then I would take hikes and go out to the country to just be able to settle myself again. And she said, I never realized how that might not be the healthiest way
Mhm.
to to proceed.
Yeah. This is an adaptation to trauma right here.
Yeah.
So when you were being dutiful and helpful and you derived a sense of value from this, what did it give you? What did it do for you?
Oh, I think it made me feel accomplished.
Mhm.
It has given me a lot of confidence in my life.
Yeah.
Um,
What
and
about
s
it gives you confidence and accomplishment?
well, I think being able to be there for people,
Mhm.
um, being able to handle life and not be
Mhm.
flustered by it and
Yeah.
um,
Be strong,
to
independent, do
to
everything on your
to be
own.
strong, yeah, to be
Yeah.
independent, all of the things
Mhm.
that we reward, especially in this society,
Yes.
being a strong, independent,
Mhm.
accomplished,
Yeah.
and so there are a lot of rewards to being that way.
Yeah. Yeah,
However,
that
it's not everything, it's not the whole story.
no. No, see that's the trauma right there. That's a traumatic experience for a child because if your sense of value, belonging, acceptance, your place in your family or your community is derived upon what you do and what you provide. Well, if you don't do those things, then you lose your place in the family. You lose your place in the community.
You do in your
So,
mind. I would argue with you, Julian, that for a
mhm,
lot of people, they don't lose their place, but in their mind they do,
yeah,
because that's the
and they
story they
learned that
told
somewhere.
themselves.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah, and they learned it somewhere. It's not
right.
that's not a natural human dynamic right there. That's a learned dynamic from something that's happening in the environment. So they're picking up these cues somewhere, whether it's real or perceived, right? Whether those are the actual things, the intention, we'll say, that the parents are communicating, whether that's what they're really trying to communicate or it's unintentional and it's just, a byproduct of the structure of the family, the amount of siblings, the way that society works and functions. They learned it somewhere. And this right here, that this dynamic that our value, our acceptance is dependent on what we can do or provide is very much against human nature. See, when we're children, our most fundamental need is to be loved, to be accepted, to be cherished, to be valued, to have a secure attachment with our caregivers. And what I mean by secure is there's nothing that we can do to break that connection. And there's nothing that we can do to earn that connection. What I'm saying here is that we can rest knowing that our connection is secure and that we are valued and cherished just for who we are. But the vast majority of us don't have that. In fact, I don't think I've ever met or seen anybody in our society who really does have that. And when we adapt to that, then we try to achieve, we try and do the things so that way we can be valued, be
Right.
accepted.
And, as a parent,
Hmm.
you I've also spent many, many years as um, like a parenting, I was a relational league leader and just talking with a lot of mothers and, as you're going up through and then talking with a lot of parents of high schoolers,
Hmm.
everybody's trying to raise that
Yes.
child.
We're
And
trying the best we can. Yes.
everybody's trying. People are trying
Uh-huh.
different things,
Yes.
and it is impossible to turn out the perfect person.
Precisely. This is something we want to be very aware of right here. So
Yeah,
when we look back at at our childhood and our relationship with our parents, we're not blaming them. We're not accusing them or trying to punish them. They did the best they could. Now, I had parents that did not do anywhere near as good as your parents did, I can tell you that, and they did the best they could. With all the skills and the tools that they had, they did everything that they could, and they could have done a whole lot better.
yep,
So that's the point right there is yes, our parents did the best we can. We had loving parents. And there were lots of areas where there was pain, there was trauma, and we adapted to it. And this is what we really want to look at. Blaming anybody, blaming our parents, blaming society, all of these things, it takes away our power to enact changes in our life. And it's not conducive to any outcome because if our parents had a dynamic with us, if we had lots of siblings, for instance, and you're the oldest, I was the oldest as well. Um, you take on responsibilities, and that's not your job. Your job is to be raised and to be cared for by your parents, but we take on the responsibilities, see, so we adapt to it. And that's not them trying to hurt us. That's not them trying to harm us in any way. These are just the dynamics. So we make the best with what we can do. And if we're going to blame our parents for that, we're also going to blame ourselves because that pattern that they had, we have it too. It's inside of us as well.
yeah,
S-
and I would, um, I'd push back a little to say that, um, you don't raise that the best way to raise kids is not by giving them responsibility because I think that, there are a lot of benefits to a lot of things that there's so many good ways to raise little human beings. And the other thing that I learned having having 3 very different boys was that they're not the same, and what they need is
Mhm.
not the same. It's tricky. It's very tricky raising little humans
I agree.
because what each child needs
Hmm.
is so different, and you think you have it, and then all of a sudden somebody
Hmm.
else comes along with entirely different needs.
Yes.
So,
Yeah. I think that, well, everybody's unique and individual in
yeah,
their own ways, right? So all three of your boys have three different parents because they have different temperaments.
yep,
They have different expressions. They have different ways of connecting. And so each one of them connected with you in a totally different way.
yep,
So they have different parents all along. And on the other hand, there are fundamental human needs. So whenever I work with somebody who has some sort of trauma and they're trying to figure out how they can work with that trauma, how can they comfort and soothe the part of them that's still carrying around all that pain. And I ask them, what did they need when they were experiencing this? The answers are almost always identical. It's some variation of the exact same thing, which is I needed somebody to be with me. I needed somebody to see me, to understand me, to hear me. In other words, to be attuned to me, to be attuned to my emotional experience, and to go through it with me and show me how to go through this. Help me learn how to comfort this. Help me learn how to navigate this difficulty. Help me learn how to have protection. Help me learn how to set boundaries. And then, of course, to do so consistently. Almost everybody says some variation of that. And then, of course, everybody gets those things or interacts with them in their own very unique individual ways.
So I hadn't thought about it that way. My experience of being in the trauma
Hmm.
was to just get through to a point where I was able to function normally again and feel
Hmm.
okay.
Yeah.
And for me, it was it was ongoing for a bit because um the there was police work, and then court system was
Yeah.
involved, and so it dragged it out for a while. And after that, um I just wanted to move on as quickly as I could. So it took the better part of a year to just become myself again.
Hmm.
But when you have gone through trauma, it does change the way you operate.
Yeah.
You know, you're more on guard and you're more controlled.
That's trauma.
Yeah.
The way that I define trauma is it's not about the thing that happened to you. It's about how it affected you afterwards. So with every trauma, we get limited, we get constricted. Our range of motion, the way that we interact with the world afterwards is altered, is changed. That's the trauma. There's a traumatic experience, and then the trauma is what happens afterwards.
And it's interesting that that need to the fear of what can happen creates a lot of need to control the way we see things.
Hmm.
I know I was overhearing some people at a venue that I was at talking about a car accident that had happened in
Hmm.
the last few weeks, and people in the community had been talking about it. And there was a parent with their kids, and people were speculating without any good information that what they were
Hmm.
saying was correct. But they were speculating about the things that this parent must have done wrong to cause the accident.
Hmm.
And at first I was thinking, that is hurtful
Hmm.
to be making up stories about what this person must have been doing. But then I realized that that was just people who feel so shaken by things that we just don't have control over, that you try and get control by saying they must have done something. I would never do that, to
Hmm.
feel like you have control and that thing would never happen to you. It's all kind of a desire to keep control over a life
Yeah.
that sometimes you just can't control.
Yeah. And that itself is a trauma right there, which is when we go through pain as children and we have no way of navigating it. One way that we adapt to that is by trying to control things around us. Again, this is if we had somebody to go through it with us and help us navigate these difficulties, there would be no need to try to control things. So I think just about everybody around us right now is dealing with some amount of trauma.
I was just going to say that's the human condition.
Right
you
now it
know?
is. That's not how it should be. That's not the natural human condition, but that is where we're at right now.
I think, this is um, my belief is that this grand adventure that we get to live on this in this life on Earth is to have these experiences because
Mhm.
these really hard experiences are where you grow.
Yeah.
I always have learned the most in the hard things
Mhm.
because when life is easy, you're just chilling along. When life is hard, you've got to figure things out.
Yeah.
And I really realized when I was sitting in therapy, which was very difficult for me, um, that it was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was also the most I had ever grown in my life.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. There's no way to avoid the challenging, difficult areas in life, and I completely agree with you that it is usually in those areas where the best gems, the best treasures, and I'm talking in not like a physical one, but the internal ones where we really grow and cultivate some part of us that could only grow through those difficulties. These are the areas where they come from. And I think right now, the vast majority of us have no idea how to navigate hard times because when we were kids and we were navigating difficulties, we didn't have anybody there to help us go through it.
Um, Talk more about that.
hmm
In what way?
Well, I won't ask you this question, but this is a question that I always ask people who go through trauma, which is, especially when they were kids, which is who'd you talk to about it? And the vast majority of the time, I would say 99.9% of the time, people say, I didn't talk to anybody about it. I was completely alone with it. And when they do say that they talked to somebody about it, very frequently, the person that they were talking to, whether it was their parent or their caregiver, whoever, they didn't see them going through it. In fact, their parent or caregiver most of the times needed somebody to take care of them in those situations. So then when the child is talking to their parent or caregiver about the thing that happened, they're talking to them trying to take care of their parents' emotions. So in other words, they're totally alone with their emotional experience. Nobody was there with them. Nobody was there to see what they were going through and to nurture and comfort them. I've seen this time and time again. So we're all alone with it, and we never once learn how to navigate it. Instead, we learn that in these situations, we show up for other people, or we do these things, or we bury our emotions and we put on the mask and we try to be strong, independent, or we distract and disconnect from it. So we have all these adaptations. Everybody's got the adaptations, but very rarely do people actually know how to navigate the actual experience.
I think probably there's a possibility that um, the people who need to reach out and work with someone
hmm
um, had probably that experience of not sharing what was really happening. In my childhood, I my mother would come in at night with all of the other kids in the family. She would come into my room at night, sit on the side of the bed, and say, It seems like it wasn't a good day," or something like that, and I would
hmm
have the opportunity to talk with her.
hmm
And you're right, sometimes because I am who I am, I would always be reading whoever I was with as to what do they need, but in those
hmm
times, I can remember very clearly being very honest with my mother about my feelings. However, I have another sibling who never had a problem telling what she was
Mhm.
thinking and feeling. She's got a very different personality than I do. And so I think that there are people who are much more comfortable or much less worried about what other people are thinking or
Mhm.
feeling than some of us who are really empathic
Sure.
and um, are really looking out for other people.
Mhm. Well, you and that sibling grew up with totally different parents in a completely different household too, because you both see the world in different ways. You both have different temperaments. Your
Mhm.
parents connected to you at different times. You were the firstborn. You had these different roles. You had a time where you were just with your parents, and your older sibling never had that. So, yeah, each one of you adapted and developed in completely different circumstances. Even though you were in the same household with the exact same parents, you both had different households and parents.
And yeah, in different temperaments.
Yeah,
Yeah,
precisely.
yeah.
Yeah, we make do with what we got. I mean, everybody's doing their best out there. And all the parents, it sounds like, your parents, your household really tried and did the best they can. And yeah, and we learn from those. I
Yep.
mean, you're learning all sorts of things from all of these experiences of how, early development affected you throughout your life. And this is where we can really start to take responsibility, accountability for it and say, okay, I'm going to learn how to work with these and I'm going to do things perhaps a different way. I'm curious, what did it look like for you when you started working with the buried emotions, the buried feelings, when these started coming up for you? What did you do with them?
Are you are you talking about when I started with PTSD symptoms or when I started talking with a therapist?
Yeah, see, there's an interesting distinction here. So you're referring to the PTSD symptoms as in when the emotions from the initial experience resurfaced. Is that accurate?
Um, yeah, but it wasn't recognizable. So
Hmm.
the craziness of PTSD is that symptoms start popping up that don't feel like they're attached.
Of course, yeah,
And
they come up in all sorts of ways.
right.
They're
And
just bursting out the seams and you don't make sense of it.
yeah, yeah. And
Hmm.
so I felt pretty crazy at that point.
Hmm.
And when I finally started going to the therapist, then um I felt like I just needed to talk about the trauma and then that would be done and I could go back to my life and
Hmm.
everything would be fine. Um, I didn't I didn't see that I wasn't that emotionally I wasn't um, able to express myself that well. There was a lot of stuff that I was hiding that I didn't want to talk about. I mean,
Hmm.
the reason that you, one of the reasons that you misstore memories that are traumatic to begin with is because it's too uncomfortable
Hmm.
to keep re-experiencing them, to put the story to them so that you can store
Yeah,
them properly in your memory. So
it's a defense
you
mechanism.
don't put a story to it, you just shove
Mhm.
the sensations that you were feeling away because they're so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So to be in therapy and start discussing
Hmm.
sensations and stuff that makes you feel that uncomfortable is really
Hmm.
difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the defense mechanism right there that kicks in. We all have it. It's built into every one of us, which is when our experience gets too painful or too overwhelming, meaning that we don't have the ability to navigate it, the defense mechanism kicks in and we disconnect from it. And one of the ways that we disconnect from it is by burying it and then distracting, staying away, avoiding it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's in every one of us. It's incredibly wise. There's so much wisdom and it saves us in those moments because those moments are so overwhelming and it becomes a source of suffering later in life if those things don't get addressed. So when the when you're in therapy now and you're starting to unpack all of these things that are coming up for you and you're starting to work with them, what'd you do?
There was a lot of time that I didn't do anything. I didn't talk. I did
Uh-huh.
I
Yeah.
was in my therapist's office, and I was, um, so uncomfortable, and I didn't know
Mhm.
what to say. My mind would go blank, which is another defense mechanism,
Yeah.
and I wouldn't know what to say, and one of the really important things that he conveyed to me right away was that he wasn't going to direct the therapy,
Mhm.
that I was in control of anything that I wanted to talk about, and I could talk about anything I wanted.
Yeah.
And that is really important as a doing trauma work with people who have had something happen to them that they had no control over,
Mhm.
that they be able to control their therapy session.
Sure. Yeah.
So the ball was in my court, and I was just going blank all the time. I didn't know what I was supposed to talk about, and there were things I knew I didn't wanna talk about,
Mhm.
because if I talked, then people would know what I thought about. And when you're beating yourself up for your thoughts, or
Mhm.
you're embarrassed by yourself or humiliated by yourself, then you don't want people to know what you spend your time thinking about. And so I sat in silence a lot, and there were tricks that he did that would help me to talk, and things that I finally realized were ways that I could get over the hump, and be able to get some help with talking.
Mhm.
But I didn't realize that so much of how I operated over the years between the time I was raped and the time I actually had to go to therapy, that that kind of way of um, avoiding things, numbing feelings, handling people, trying to keep control of situations had just kind of insinuated itself into my relationships and the way I did
Mhm.
everything. And so
Yeah.
there was a lot to talk about, but I didn't understand that for a long time.
Yeah.
That it really didn't matter where we started. It was just important to talk.
Just to get started.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that pretty generally didn't matter what I talked about, it was gonna have something to do with
Oh, yeah.
maybe a maladaptive way of
Mhm.
handling a situation because I
Oh,
had been
yeah.
traumatized.
Yeah. Yeah. Those patterns show up in every aspect of our lives. We can see their fingerprints everywhere.
Yeah, and it's still and honestly, I don't think people actually need to be traumatized to have maladaptive ways of
Mhm.
responding to situations, but if you
Sure.
don't talk about it, you're never going to see it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think just about everybody's traumatized right now in our society. In fact, I don't think that I once thought that there were like pockets of cultures that were uncontacted, but the more that I sat in contemplation over that, I was like, oh man, they're dealing with, constantly avoiding the guns and everything else that's coming in and intruding onto them. So I think every single person in this world right now is dealing with some trauma or another.
So how do you define okay, I think it would probably be helpful to have a common,
Uh-huh.
vocabulary. So how do you define the trauma that you're talking about? Not the traumatic event, because we
Hmm.
know what that is. That's a situation where, um, something happens that you don't have control over. They talk about the fight or flight um,
Hmm.
response where you're you're trying somehow to control what's happening, and something happens that you can't control. It could be a car accident, it could be
Hmm.
a shooting, it could be sexual assault, just
Yeah.
something that you can't control. But the trauma that you're talking about, how do you define that?
Okay. So it could be bad things that happen that shouldn't happen. That's what you were just referring to, which would be most of the times called big T trauma. Your parents get incarcerated, your parents die, you have abusive parents, so on and so forth. These are easy to identify. But another equally as powerful and impactful trauma that happens is when good things that are supposed to happen don't happen. So, if we have very loving parents, for instance, very caring parents, they want to do everything they can, but they're stressed out with life. Their focus is on the finances, the economics, the providing, the meeting the bills, their job, so on and so forth. And they're so stressed that they can't be present with you as a child. So you don't have the connection that you really need, the attunement. So when you're scared and you come into your mom's room at night and you say, Mommy, Daddy, I'm scared. And they say, it's okay. There's nothing to be scared of. And they take you back to your room and they put you back to bed. That's traumatic because they didn't see, oh, you were scared. You learned that your emotions don't matter, that your emotions aren't valid. And then you're dismissed. Maybe your parents are getting modern day medical advice that says when your baby cries out, don't hold them. Let them learn to self soothe. Let them learn to become independent. So when the baby's crying their head out, trying to have somebody come and comfort and soothe their emotions because they don't know how to do that, and nobody comes, that's traumatic, highly traumatic. So it's bad things that happen that shouldn't happen, but it's also good things that are supposed to happen that don't happen. That's the traumatic experience. The trauma itself is, how do we adapt to that? How do we navigate this experience? And then this adaptation becomes our default pattern in terms of how we navigate life afterwards. That's the trauma.
Okay. And so when there are major traumatic events,
Hmm.
sometimes and some people can think that through, can think through what happened, can think through their own response,
Hmm.
can put a narration to it, put a story to it. They put the
Hmm.
words to the emotions, the sensations that they feel, and they store that.
Hmm.
And what I experienced, which is a little different um, than the handling of all of your life situations, is that for me, when I had the experience of somebody breaking into my apartment and standing
Hmm.
over me in the middle of the night and raping me, was that after that happened, thinking about it and putting a narration to it and storing it correctly was not something that I it was so uncomfortable that what
Hmm.
I wanted to do was just shove the whole thing away.
Yeah.
So the way that our different systems in our brain works is when we're storing memories properly, it's like filing something in a file cabinet. It's filed correctly, and if you want to go back and retrieve it, you can. Um, when you just have sensations that you try and shove away, they kind of are activated in this part of our brain. It's called the amygdala, and I've seen it termed as the amygdala attack. When things happen that trigger us, um, we start we start pulling up the same kind of weird sensations that may have happened during the trauma.
Hmm.
And it can happen over and over again, and it can be triggered by all sorts of things that don't seem attached to the trauma.
Mhm.
But the really cool thing about our brain, and you've referenced some of it, is that that's our that's our brain responding to life in a way to try and keep us safe. That
Sure.
that if there's a trigger that our brain is assessing maybe a threat, that it's going to give us sensations that make us really pay attention and do something to keep ourselves safe.
Sure.
So, though, but that's the part that also feels crazy when you have post-traumatic stress disorder.
Mhm.
And and everybody responds to life. It's all learning, right?
Sure.
Um, that we may have maladaptive um, ways uh, that we facilitate things that we've learned in our own life and our own experiences, but that's different than the way that the amygdala may be responding to memories that weren't stored correctly.
Mhm.
I'm sure I have all sorts of maladaptive ways that I came to in a somewhat healthy manner, but it's how I interpreted them. I think
Yeah.
one of them is the don't say anything, just
Mhm.
figure it out yourself because you're strong and tough.
Yeah. And, I mean, if you think about it from the perspective of a perpetrator, if you're a perpetrator and you're looking for a victim, the victim you're gonna wanna find is somebody who's not gonna say anything.
Right, right.
And perpetrators, they can identify these traits in people with laser precision. Yeah. In terms of the pattern that you're describing, you know, memories are pretty complex. And yeah, they're not very well understood in a scientific term right now in terms of the storage and retrieval and these types of things. So when I look at this and we say, I got triggered by something and then the past experience came up, I think that this way of looking at the process of what's happening of being triggered is very telling to the actual experience. So when we get triggered, to say that something happens in our experience and then all of these things come up. The trigger is a metaphor here, and a trigger is this tiny little pin that you pull that sets off a mechanical cascade of things that happen, which eventually ends up in a combustion, an explosion, and a destruction. That's the trigger of a gun right there, right? As you
Right.
pull the little pin, the mechanism shut off, the gunpowder explodes, and the projectile fires and destroys something. So when we get triggered, the thing that triggered us is the pin. It's this tiny little mechanism.
Right.
And then what we have to look at is, well, what's the combustible ammunition? And where is that being carried around? Well, all of these things that are coming up, that's the combustible ammunition. So if I'm trying to think about my feelings, that means that I'm not actually feeling them. It means that I'm not actually processing them. See, if I'm up in the mental space, which is very different from the emotional space, I've already disconnected from the present moment. If I'm focusing on the narrative or the thoughts, I'm already removed from the feelings.
It's so interesting that, um, and this will happen a lot when you ask some people how they feel. People
Hmm.
that aren't really in touch with their feelings, they can keep telling you what they're thinking.
All the thoughts.
Right, all the thoughts, but
Hmm.
not the feelings, and I
Yeah.
was so there when I first started therapy. I was so
Yeah.
bad that by
Same.
the time I got to therapy, I couldn't claim a feeling. I would call it a feeling of.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize until I was in my first class and we were talking about emotions and like the different, you have your cognitive and your spiritual and your emotional and behavioral
Yeah.
um, areas.
Yeah.
And I was talking with, when I would talk with people about my emotions and talk about the feeling of, I started realizing that that was odd.
Yeah.
And it never occurred to me before that I was so, I had at that point was so separated from my emotions that I couldn't
Mhm.
claim a feeling for my own for a long time.
Yes.
Felt very uncomfortable to do that.
Yeah.
And the first time that you were talking about sensations in the little trigger pin that starts a sensation. And after I was in therapy for a while, not real long, but probably weeks to a month, I started having these sensations in my back of I called them the creeps. It felt like there were bugs behind me. It felt like there were like
Mhm.
worms and snakes and spiders and things
Yeah.
on a wall right behind my back. Like I was
Mhm.
standing right next to this wall and they were behind my back.
Yeah.
And it was the worst feeling, and it would happen, when I was out at night, like, I was at a football game one time, and
Mhm.
that sensation started, and I couldn't make it stop, and I couldn't figure out what was going on or why I was having this sensation, and it was probably another few weeks to a month that I recognized the way it felt was the the heebie-jeebies feeling that you get in your back when as kids, you
Mhm.
sit around telling ghost stories,
Yeah.
and you wanna look behind you, but if you're with a
Yeah.
group of kids, you don't wanna look behind you because 'cause they'll laugh at you, so
Mhm.
you don't, and you just have that really creepy sensation in your back.
Yeah. Danger
That was
sense.
the feeling, but what is the emotion that goes along with that was the first time I identified an emotion, and it was dread.
Dread.
And dread was the feeling that I had when I woke up in the dark and somebody was standing next to my bed.
Fear.
So
Terror.
so that I was just
Mhm.
having the sensation of that with
Yeah.
none of the identification of what it was. It was just like felt like bugs against my back.
Yeah.
And that was it was t and I have to say that when I was it was felt really good to identify, to put
Mhm.
together a word with the sensation,
Yeah.
but because I was also in graduate school for counseling, when I was sitting there and I was realizing that that stuff was happening to me, those sensations were happening to me, I was just like I felt like 2 people in the same room. I felt like I was a fly on the wall going, "Wow, this is amazing," and I was thinking to myself,
Mhm.
this is amazing the way that our human bodies work.
Yeah. Isn't that incredible? So you described the danger sense, right? That's
Yeah,
the crawling feeling, which is we have the ability, of course humans have the ability to pick up on danger
right,
because we grew up in nature.
right.
And if you're walking around in nature, you don't survive very long if you can't pick up when there's danger, when somebody has a hostile intent, when somebody is looking at you with the intent to do something harmful. We have the ability to pick that up, but you nailed it when you said it's kind of like sitting around with a bunch of kids telling ghost stories and you want to look behind you to see if there's a threat, but you don't because they're going to laugh at you. You suppress it.
And
We
that's what I was
disconnect from it.
saying, the is so amazing about our brains, is
Hmm.
that the amygdala, it's the amygdala's job to identify those threats to keep us alive. And what was happening is originally the threat was in the dark. I woke up in the dark and there was danger, and I
Hmm.
got that feeling. It was coming back, 18, 20 years later when I
Yeah.
was struggling with PTSD, and all I was getting was the sensation, but that was my body
Hmm.
saying to me, "You're in the dark, you better watch out."
Listen to me.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
and
saying listen.
that happens when you have, um, something happens that makes your eyes dilate or makes you start hyperventilating, some kind of
Hmm.
trigger. That's
Hmm.
your body saying, "You better watch out carefully, you better get ready to run." And
Yeah.
when you're hyperventilating, you're oxygenating your muscles so that you have more energy to either fight or flee.
Sure.
So
Mhm.
those are all things that our body does in response to what is perceives as a threat, even though it's not
Mhm.
really a threat. And the part that makes you feel crazy is you're not really in that threatening situation anymore and you can't figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
But those are
Well,
all
yeah, of course.
PTSD kind of symptoms.
Yeah. Yeah, because those sensations got buried and they
Right.
didn't process, they didn't play out the role that they were supposed to play out. And so they're still here
Right. And
and they still
especially
come up.
the the words got the words never got added, which is why it's so confusing.
Mhm.
You have the
Yeah.
sensations that got buried with no words. And
Mhm.
so the therapy is in a very safe environment,
Yeah.
adding the story to what all those sensations are.
Mhm. Yeah, this is what I was talking about earlier, which is we have an experience, we have the sensations, we don't know how to navigate it.
Right,
So we bury it, we disconnect from it. And then later on, we have to learn how to go back into those spaces and process it and navigate it and listen to it and connect to it and feel the things and express the boundaries or the emotion or the behavior that the emotions are trying to get us to do. Go ahead.
right. So what I'm hearing right now in a lot of people's thoughts is that sounds really uncomfortable. I think I'm just going to bury it again.
Hmm.
And what I
Yeah.
have to say is when you get to that point where you actually start talking about the stuff, talking
Hmm.
about the things that you've been hiding, that there is a very it's kind of a freeing or a fresh air kind of feeling. I would get it. It felt like little holes were being poked into me to allow fresh air in. And I
Yeah.
kind of related it to if you can imagine how stuffy it feels when you're in a prison cell or something and
Hmm.
you don't have any fresh air.
Hmm.
It's just always stale air. And
Hmm.
suddenly somebody pokes some holes into the outside and
Yeah.
fresh air starts coming in
Hmm.
through those little holes. That is exactly what I felt
Yeah.
when I would have a good therapy session, that I finally had poked some holes into that armor that I had around myself.
Yeah.
And it felt really good. And it was a slow process, especially for me because I was so good at not talking
Hmm.
that it took especially long for me to finally realize that I was in control, and if I wanted to get better, I needed to talk. And it took a while. Took a while going, you know, this feels terrible to finally realize the reason that it felt bad was because I was refusing to, I think, be embarrassed.
Yeah.
I
You were
think I was,
confined in that armor.
yeah, but it's
Hmm.
it's about embarrassment and humiliation. It's about
Shame.
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 Yeah,
Yeah.
that you just are so ashamed of the way you have that and for me, the shame wasn't the rape that somebody broke into my house. I had
Hmm.
had a date rape when I was in college, and I was so humiliated by just my own part in that because I was on a date with this person that I just when it happened, I thought to myself, I am never going to think about this. I am never going to talk about it. I'm never going to say what happened to anybody. And
Yeah.
it wasn't for a long time that I realized that I was preventing myself from getting well if I didn't talk about that. And,
Hmm.
as soon as I started talking about it, and I was so embarrassed, and my therapist said, "How old were you?"
Yeah.
And I said, I was 19. And he said, "So you're a kid."
Yeah.
He said, "Do you
Yeah.
know
It's
kids
not your
that
fault.
haven't done something stupid?"
Yeah.
And it was like, "No," but I had never looked at myself as a kid.
Yeah. Of
You carry
course.
with you
Hmm.
as though you're the fully formed
Young
person that you
adult.
are. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
everybody was saying to you when you were a kid, "Are you really a kid? Aren't you adult?"
yeah, but when he said
Yeah.
to me, "So you were a kid," I was like,
Mm,
it was the first time I ever thought about it
yeah.
that way. And like there was
Yeah.
no judgment from him.
Yeah. You're
And it was
allowed to
the
be a
first
kid.
time I could look at it without judging myself.
Beautiful.
But it took me several years to get brave enough
Yeah.
to talk about that. And once I did, once I broke through from the armor that I was carrying around me, that's when I got better. I got better really
Mhm.
quickly.
It can happen very quickly. It's getting through those
Yeah.
defenses. Brene Brown talks a lot about shame in the sense, in that exact way. She says we want to bury it.
Yeah.
We want to keep it hidden in the dark, and when we do, it just grows and multiplies and intensifies. But when we
Yeah.
can take it and put it out in the light and share it with somebody and say, "This is what I'm carrying," oh, it's just like you said. All of that fresh air wafts right in, and you get relief and refreshment, and it happens so quickly, but getting there is the hard part.
Yeah. And Brene Brown also said something um, that really resonated with me, and it was a real aha moment because it was the first time I realized it wasn't just me when she said that the number one shame trigger for women
Mhm.
is their body and body image.
Are you
And that
talking
was
about the Are you talking about the book, I Thought It Was Me, But It's Not? Or I
no,
Thought It Was
this
Just Me,
was
But It's
she
Not?
did she had a Netflix special,
Okay.
I think it was called The Call to Courage.
Okay.
Um, and she said in that the number one shame trigger for women is their bodies and body image.
Sure.
And that was um, one of the difficulties I had in talking about anything that happened with
Mhm.
me, because the idea of putting a visual into anybody's mind about my body was felt humiliating.
Yeah.
And it when she said that, it was like, "Oh, that's not just me, that's all women."
Yeah.
And with men, it's about appearing weak. And
Mhm.
so there are things that you're going to hold to yourself just because you can't imagine bringing that up and putting that out there and being the one to actually do it when that's the most humiliating thing that you can think of.
Yeah. An inability to accept yourself, judgment, criticism, evaluation. These are dynamics that keep us in those same patterns, and we learn it from somewhere. Linda, I'm really enjoying our conversation today. I would do want to be mindful of time. We are right there right now.
Yeah.
I would talk to you all day. I really enjoy this. I'm so glad that you reached out, and I'm so glad that we got to have this conversation. Tell me though, where? Well, tell people who are listening, where can we find your information, your book, anything that you're putting out there?
So the book is called Braving Therapy, Rape, Buried Trauma, and the Triumphant Journey Over PTSD. And the my reason for writing the book is that it's really a journey through therapy, and it shows through especially the conversations with my therapist and me, and then my my journaling about it afterwards, how change happens, how difficult it was early on, and the way that you change your mind, the way you change your perspective. And so that's the crux of the book, and the reason that I wrote it is kind of a window for people to want to see not only what therapy is like, but how change happens. So that's the book. It's available on Amazon, or it can be ordered from any bookstore. It's in some libraries. And I have a website and a Facebook page that are L Feig Knipe, just my first initial, L Feig Knipe,
Wonderful, Linda.
and you
I will
can
be
find me
sure to
there.
have. What was that?
You can find me there.
Yes, I will link all of that in the show notes. And so I'm very happy that you have this information out there. This journey of recovering and healing all of these things that have happened to us and navigating them and learning from them. It's very uncomfortable in the beginning, especially. And navigating that discomfort is crucial to getting to the place that we're trying to get to. So I'm so happy that you have this out there. I'm so happy that you're sharing this story. So much of your process resonates with exactly what I've gone through and what so many people that I work with go through. So I really hope that a lot of people can find this information and find some inspiration and commonality with this journey. Thank you so much for putting this out there.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me on so we could talk about it.
It's been lovely. Thank you, Linda.